Chapter 3 is over nutrients and membrane transport. The first part on nutrients is kind of a nutrition summary. So you're going to talk about the difference between macronutrients and micronutrients. Macronutrients are those things that are required by your body in large amounts. So water, proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, all of that would be considered macronutrients. Two important things about macronutrients. Fiber is very important. You don't really digest fiber, but it's important to help control transit time through your colon, so how quickly food moves through your digestive tract. Obviously, you don't want that to go too fast or too slow. If either of those two things happen, bad stuff happens. So fiber helps control that. It also helps control cholesterol levels in your body as well. Essential amino acids are those amino acids that you have to eat. You cannot make them on your own in your body, and that's actually one reason that vegetarians have to be very careful to eat a wide variety of protein sources, because the simplest way to get essential amino acids is in meat protein. So if you're not going to do that, and you've got to eat a lot of different protein sources to get those essential amino acids. Micronutrients are those nutrients that are required in very, very tiny amounts. So typically we're talking about vitamins and minerals in this category. There is a chart in your study guide that goes through the most important vitamins and minerals. Make sure you know the information on that chart because there will be test questions over it. And it talks about what happens if you don't have enough or if you have too much of one thing versus another. Vitamins A, D, E, and K are all fat-soluble vitamins, which means your body can store them in fat, which means they can be toxic if you have too much of them. A lot of the other vitamins, like vitamin C, is water-soluble, so if you ingest too much, your body just eliminates it in your urine, and it's not too big of a deal, typically. But the fat-soluble vitamins, so A, D, E, and K, are the ones that could become toxic quite easily in large amounts. The next section deals with membrane transport. Remember that your cell membrane is composed of this phospholipid bilayer. So it's two layers of phospholipids. The polar heads face outward, so one side faces the interior of the cell. So the mitochondria is down here, the nucleus, the ribosomes, all that's the interior of the cell. And then the other side faces the exterior of the cell. So this is kind of a zoomed in view. So the middle part of that, the tails are considered hydrophobic, and then the heads are hydrophilic. So you've got two hydrophilic areas out here because the inside the cell and outside the cell are both water-based, and then the tails kind of go to the middle because they're hydrophobic. So what this means is it means that it's hard for things to cross through that membrane because they have to get through a hydrophilic area, a hydrophobic area, and another hydrophilic area to get through, so one way or the other. So not many things can pass through the membrane on their own, other than gases. So oxygen, carbon dioxide actually will freely diffuse across the membrane. But most everything else, charged molecules, bigger molecules, have to be carried across. So let's talk a little bit about how that happens. You've got active transport and passive transport. Passive transport simply means no energy is required for the process to occur. If you have active transport, then you have to use energy to get things to cross. And remember that the energy currency of the cell, so how we use dollars and change to kind of pay for things, the way the cell pays for stuff is it uses the molecule ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So that triphosphate means that this particular molecule has 3 phosphates on it. When it loses one phosphate, it's almost like it's paying money to have something happen. So a lot of times in these processes, adenosine triphosphate, ATP, will actually become ADP, adenosine diphosphate, so 2 phosphates, after it's paid up its phosphate to pay for something to occur in the cell. So after something crosses the membrane or some other process that requires energy. So passive transport typically has to do with diffusion. Diffusion is the movement of molecules or particles from an area of very high concentration where there are a lot of them to an area of low concentration where there are not many. So when you if you had a glass of water and you put a drop of food coloring in, that food coloring doesn't just stay in the middle. Remember, it diffuses out until that whole glass has a uniform distribution of the food coloring molecules. So the same thing happens with people people. If you go into a very crowded room, you're probably going to want to leave. So you're going to go from an area of high concentration, that crowded room, to an area of low concentration, maybe out in the hallway where there are not as many people. And this occurs until equilibrium is reached, where the particles are the same on either side of that membrane. So whether you're in the room or in the hallway, the distribution of people is about the same. It requires energy to keep them different. So that's what we're going to talk about with the active transport. So if you are talking about diffusion of water, so the movement of water across a membrane, across a cell membrane, from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, that is considered osmosis, is the term for that. So osmosis is just diffusion of water. If you are trying to move particles against their concentration gradient, so you're trying to shove them uphill, so like you're trying to pack one more person in that crowded room, that requires energy. That's active transport, and the cell will use that for various processes. It's almost like they're storing up energy. So if you are cramming a ton of people into a very small room and you're just pushing them in, and then you shut the door, or maybe you have a lot of stuff and you put it in your closet and you just cram it all in and then you shut the door really quickly. When you open that door later, what's going to happen? Well, they're all going to come tumbling out. So all the people are going to come rushing out of the room, or all that stuff in your closet is going to come tumbling down. So it's almost like a form of stored energy for the cell to have a lot of ions or particles in the cell for a particular reason. That's how nerve impulses work, is the cell will pump ions into the cell, and then when it fills it up, it kind of releases the floodgates and they flood out. And it's kind of a way that those the membrane transport occurs. All right, so the last two things as far as transport goes would be exocytosis and endocytosis. These are kind of different processes. They're a little bit separate because what's happening is you're actually taking a particle either into the cell or out of the cell, but what happens is it's a membrane that kind of travels to the cell membrane and then it fuses with the cell membrane and then kind of expels it into the cell. That would be endocytosis. Exocytosis, you'd have a vesicle come to the cell membrane, it'll fuse with the cell membrane and then expel its contents outside of the cell. That would be exocytosis. I do want to talk about the different solutions and what happens to the cell in these different solutions because it's important for your exam. And this has to do with diffusion. So if we have a scenario set up where you've got a cell, and so all these little round black things are cells, and that cell is impermeable, meaning it will not allow it to cross, impermeable to these red particles, but permeable to water, so a semi-permeable membrane is that term, semi-permeable. So it's permeable to water, it lets water freely cross, but it is impermeable to these little red particles. If you have the same concentration of the particles inside the cell and outside the cell, that is considered an isotonic solution. Iso means equal. Think about isosceles triangle. The different sides on that triangle are equal. So an isotonic solution. So in this solution, we do still have water moving. So water is going to be moving into the cell. But because we don't have any sort of concentration gradient set up, water is also going to be moving out of the cell. And so what's going to happen is the amount of water coming into the cell and coming out of the cell is going to stay the same. There's just going to be an equal amount because these particles have the same concentration. There's not really a gradient, so the water doesn't have a gradient. So an isotonic solution is a great way to rehydrate someone if they're dehydrated. You give that IV because it doesn't cause any damage to the cells. All right, now in a hypotonic solution, what that means, hypo means low or under. Think about hypothermia, means you're cold, so the temperature's low. So hypotonic solution, you've got a lot more of those particles inside the cell than in the solution. So what that means is that you've got a higher concentration of the particles in the cell than in the solution. If those particles could cross the cell membrane, then they would go from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. But remember, we set up this scenario where those particles cannot cross this membrane. So only water can cross the membrane. So what's going to happen is that water, there's a lot of water out here outside the cell, and there's very little water inside the cell. So the water is going to flow from an area of high concentration, so outside the cell, to an area of low concentration, to into the cell. So what we've got here is that water is going to flow into the cell, and the cell is going to expand, and it could even explode. So that's what happens in a hypotonic solution. Now, the opposite of that would be considered a hypertonic solution. In a hypertonic solution, you've got a lot more of the particles outside of the cell than in the cell. So we've got lots of these red dots outside the cell, only one red dot inside the cell. So in this situation, we've actually got more water in the cell than we have outside the cell, relative to the concentration. So that water is going to flow from an area of high concentration of water to an area of low concentration of water. So it's going to leave the cell. So the cell, in return, is going to shrink up and shrivel up. So remember that whenever we talk about these solutions, the water concentration is always opposite to the particle concentration. So in a hypotonic solution, the particles, the concentration of the particles is low in the solution, but that means that relative to that, the water concentration is quite high. In a hypertonic solution, the particle concentration in the solution is quite high. There's a lot of it. So there's not as much water in that solution. So the way the movement flows is the water flows from an area of high concentration of water to an area of an area of low concentration of water. So we're talking about the particles, and the water is going to flow from an area of low concentration of particles to an area of higher concentration of particles, because it's trying to dilute out those particles, basically. All right, so those are different types of solution, and that's kind of our brief summary here for this chapter.